The story of Marie Antoinette does not begin in France, and it certainly does not begin with a crown. It begins in Vienna, in the vast and echoing palace where she spent her childhood. Before she became a symbol, hated by some, adored by others, she was simply a girl growing up inside walls so large they made her feel small. Even as a child, she sensed she was being shaped for a life she did not choose. Her tutors hovered over her, correcting her posture, her accent, her handwriting, even the way she smiled, felt less like learning and more like being carved. Before we delve into these overlooked tales of endurance and pain, if you find yourself drawn to the hidden corners of history, please consider liking this video and subscribing for more stories like this. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from. I am always amazed that we can explore these ancient narratives together, no matter where we are in the world, united by our curiosity about the past. She grew up surrounded by ceremony, music, and endless rules. In the mornings, she practiced dancing until her feet ached. In the afternoons, she learned languages, religion, and etiquette so strict that even breathing too loudly during a royal meal was considered unacceptable. But behind her mother's expectations and the palace tutor's lectures was a girl who loved laughter more than lessons. She preferred games to responsibilities and found joy in small things: flowers, music, jokes shared with her siblings. She was soft-hearted, playful, even clumsy at times, a fact she tried to hide from her strict mother. Her mother, Empress Maria Theresa, saw Europe like a chessboard and her children as pieces to secure alliances. Marie was one of those pieces, and at 14 years old, Marie learned that she was being sent away to France to marry the future king. Even though she had known marriage would come eventually, the reality struck harder than she expected. She felt a strange mixture of excitement, fear, and the heavy weight of responsibility pressing on her chest. She wasn't just leaving home. She was leaving everything she understood: her language, her culture, her childhood. The day she left Vienna was cold. Her mother hugged her briefly, too briefly for Marie's heart, and reminded her that she was not going merely as a daughter but as a representative of Austria. Marie nodded, trying to look brave, but her throat tightened. She climbed into the carriage, refusing to cry, refusing to let the guards, servants, or diplomats see her fear. She held her hands tightly in her lap to hide the trembling. The journey to France was long and tiring. As the carriage wheels rattled over rough roads, Marie stared out the window, watching the scenery shift from the familiar Austrian mountains to foreign lands she had never seen. At night, she lay awake, thinking about the life waiting ahead of her. A husband she had never met, a court known for its harsh gossip, and expectations she was terrified of failing. When she finally reached the French border, she experienced a moment that felt like losing her identity. As tradition demanded, everything Austrian had to be stripped away: her clothes, her belongings, even her jewelry. Marie stood silently as attendants removed her garments and replaced them with French ones. She felt exposed, not just physically but emotionally. It was as if she were being told, "Your old self is gone. Now you belong to France." When she arrived in Versailles, the palace overwhelmed her. It was enormous, glittering, impossibly extravagant. The people stared at her with curiosity, judgment, and silent expectations. They saw not a young girl trying to be brave, but a symbol: the Austrian Dauphin. She felt their eyes on her as she approached her future husband, Louis. He was gentle, shy, and awkward, too awkward to put her at ease. Their first conversation was stiff and hesitant, filled with polite phrases instead of warmth. Court life was worse. The gossip was relentless. Every move she made was analyzed. If she laughed too loudly, they called her childish. If she tried to be serious, they said she was cold. If she spent money, she was extravagant. If she didn't, she was unfit for her position. She was always wrong in someone's eyes. Still, she tried. She attended ceremonies, learned the complex etiquette of Versailles, smiled through endless political dinners, and forced herself to appear confident even when she felt lost. But the loneliness never fully left her. Her marriage remained emotionally distant, and her efforts to win the approval of the court rarely succeeded. Years passed and France gradually changed. Beneath the golden ceilings of Versailles, the kingdom appeared stable and powerful, but outside the palace walls, ordinary people struggled. Bread grew expensive, jobs disappeared, hunger spread. Rumors twisted Marie into an easy target. They painted her as a foreign parasite, someone who lived in luxury while France starved. Accusations that stung not because they were accurate but because she felt powerless to counter them. As tension grew, so did the hatred directed at her. Newspapers printed lies, caricatures mocked her, and angry crowds chanted her name with venom. Marie felt fear growing inside her, but she tried to remain strong. She stood by her husband even when the pressure crushed him. She made decisions, some wise, some misguided, but always under the shadow of mounting unrest. When revolution erupted, everything changed. The palace that once felt too large suddenly felt like a trap. Marie watched her children grow frightened as angry crowds gathered outside the gates. She stayed calm for their sake even when she felt terror clawing at her throat. She held their hands tightly at night, whispering promises she could not guarantee. The day the royal family was forced to flee Versailles, she looked back at the palace one last time. It had been her home for decades, yet she never truly belonged there. As the carriage carried them away, she could feel the world she knew collapsing behind her. The escape from Versailles was not a triumphant moment. It was a desperate one. As the carriage rattled into the night, Marie sat stiffly beside her children, her hands gripping theirs with a strength that surprised even her. She tried to hide her trembling, but the fear clung to her like a second skin. She kept glancing out the window, half expecting darkness to crack open and swallow them. Louis sat across from her, silent, his face pale and heavy with the burden of failure. He had never been a decisive king. Now he looked like a man drowning in expectations he had never asked for. That night, Marie understood something painful. She would have to be stronger than him, not only as a queen, but as a woman who still had a family to protect. The escape plan was fragile from the beginning. Everything relied on timing, secrecy, and luck. Three things that seemed allergic to the French royal family. Their disguise was unconvincing, their carriage slow, and their movements predictable. Marie sensed trouble long before they reached Varennes. The people they passed didn't look fooled. Some stared too long, some whispered, some pointed. Her heart broke every time someone recognized her. Not because she feared being caught, though she did, but because she saw something new in the eyes of the people. Disappointment turning into fury. They didn't see Marie the mother, the woman, or even the queen. They saw betrayal. A royal family running from its own people. By the time they were stopped in Varennes, it was over. The game was lost. The revolutionaries surrounded the carriage, torches blazing, faces twisted with anger and triumph. Marie looked at her children first. Their tiny bodies huddled close to her, confused and terrified. She held them tighter, whispering for them to stay calm even as her own pulse hammered in her throat. When they were marched back to Paris, the crowds didn't chant like they had before. Now they jeered, they spat, they shouted insults sharp enough to pierce skin. Marie kept her head high, refusing to bend, refusing to show weakness. Not because she felt strong, but because she knew the people wanted to see her break, and she would never give them that satisfaction. Her dignity was the last thing she had left. The Palace of Tuileries became their prison. The golden halls of Versailles were replaced by narrow rooms, guarded doors, and suspicion that hung in the air like smoke. Marie spent her days shielding her children from the tension and the nights planning what to do if things got worse. And they did. Every week brought new accusations, new threats, new demands from the revolutionaries. Louis grew more withdrawn. He didn't understand the world that was emerging around him. He tried to negotiate, tried to reason with the people, but his efforts fell flat. Marie saw him shrinking into himself, and it terrified her. She felt as if she were watching a man dissolve. The revolution did not stop. It accelerated. The monarchy was declared abolished. The royal family was taken away room by room, right by right, dignity by dignity. Then came the day Louis was separated from the family entirely. Marie's breath caught when they took him away. She clung to his coat sleeve for one last second, her fingers trembling, but the guards tore them apart. After he left the room, she stood frozen, staring at the door as if willing it to open again. But it didn't. Her son cried. Her daughter hid her face. Marie forced herself to kneel, pull them close, and whisper that everything would be all right, even though she no longer believed it. Louis's execution tore through her last layer of hope. She tried to be strong, tried to be the anchor for her children, but the sound of the crowds cheering outside stabbed her like a blade. She didn't cry in front of the guards. She didn't scream. She didn't collapse. But inside, something cracked so violently she felt like she was bleeding. She still held on for her children. But the revolutionaries weren't done. They wanted more. They demanded Marie stand trial. The accusations thrown at her were wild, exaggerated, and designed to humiliate. They called her names, blamed her for years of suffering, twisted her actions into crimes. Marie stood there, her hands bound, her body thinner than ever, but her voice steady. The worst moment came when they dragged her young son into the accusations. They used him as a weapon, hoping to break her spirit completely. For the first time, Marie felt her mask slip. Her eyes filled with a pain so sharp it stunned the room into silence. She answered with a strength no one expected, refusing to let them use her child as a tool. But strength did not change the verdict. She was sentenced to death. In the final days of her life, Marie felt a strange calm settling over her. She no longer feared what would happen to her. The fear had drained out long ago, replaced with exhaustion and a quiet, almost numb acceptance. She spent her last hours thinking not of the throne, the politics, or the palace she had once lived in, but of her children and the life she had lost piece by piece. The morning they came for her, she dressed carefully, as if preparing for a ceremony she had no intention of attending but could not refuse. Her hair had been cut. Her clothes were simple. Her reflection looked older than she ever thought she would appear. Yet she still lifted her chin, still walked with dignity, still carried herself like a queen even when everything regal had been stripped from her. When they placed her on the cart that would take her through Paris, the crowds gathered again, not to admire but to witness her end. People insulted her, shouted at her, pointed as if she were some spectacle. But Marie didn't react. She kept her gaze forward. Her silence unsettled some of the crowd. They wanted fear, anger, guilt. They got none of it. She held her composure until the final steps of the scaffold. Even then, she didn't shake. She apologized to the executioner only because she accidentally stepped on his foot. It wasn't an act. Even in the face of death, she held on to the last piece of humanity she had left. And then it was over. Her life, which had begun in glittering halls and drifted through storms she never expected, ended beneath an open sky filled with shouts she would never hear again. After Marie Antoinette's execution, the air in Paris remained charged, heavy with the tension of revolution. But before that final moment, her life had become a series of quiet agonies, moments of unbearable waiting, and the slow erosion of hope. Each day in prison stretched longer than the last. The Tuileries, once a palace of laughter, opulence, and music, had become a suffocating shell. The walls were thick with mistrust, the floors echoing footsteps of guards who watched every move, and Marie felt as if she were a bird trapped in a gilded cage stripped of its beauty. Her children became her universe, the only anchors to a life that made sense. She watched them closely, studying every reaction, every flicker of emotion. Marie tried to shield them from the despair that wrapped around her like fog, but it was impossible to hide completely. The young boy, Louis Charles, often asked questions that pierced her heart. Why can't we leave? Why is everyone so angry? And the little girl, Marie Therese, clung to her mother silently, sensing the tension without understanding it. Each innocent glance at her children carried the weight of guilt Marie could not shake. She had failed them, not in love, not in care, but in protection. She could not save them from the world that had turned against their family. Even in isolation, she replayed the moments of her life repeatedly. She thought of her childhood in Austria, the carefree days before crowns and expectations consumed her. She remembered her first glimpse of Versailles, glittering under sunlight, and how she had dreamed of a life filled with purpose and beauty. Those dreams had been swallowed by reality, a kingdom unraveling, a husband incapable of decisive leadership, and a people growing restless and resentful. In her mind, she asked over and over if she could have done anything differently, any choice that might have spared them. But the answers were shadows, intangible and cruel. The trial that led to her death sentence was designed to humiliate. The charges were absurd, sometimes grotesque, and intended to inflame public anger. Marie listened to them with a composed exterior, but inside, a storm raged. She recognized the cruelty of the human mind when fear and envy combined. They blamed her for a system she had inherited, for events she had not controlled, for actions she had often opposed. The words bounced off her like arrows, but the pain they inflicted was invisible to those watching. She learned the meaning of helplessness, the kind that seeps into bones and lingers, refusing to leave. Despite everything, she found solace in small moments. A bird that landed near her window, a faint smell of flowers brought by the wind, the quiet presence of her children huddled together. These moments became her rebellion, tiny acts of retaining her humanity. She spoke to the guards sometimes, asking simple questions, teasing lightly when they were unprepared for it. In those moments, she reclaimed a fragment of the life they were trying to erase. Nights were the hardest. The darkness in the cells mirrored the darkness in her thoughts. She would lie awake, imagining her children's future without her, wondering what legacy she could leave behind. She thought about love, her love for her husband, who had faltered when he needed strength. Her love for her children, fierce and consuming. Her love for her family, far away, who could do nothing to help. Loneliness was never truly about being alone, but about being unable to reach those you care for the most. Marie felt that loneliness keenly, in every heartbeat, in every quiet sigh. Marie often reflected on dignity in the face of despair. She understood that her life and the way it ended would be judged by history. In that knowledge, she found a strange calm. If she could leave the world with the last shred of her identity intact, even in death, she would do it. She practiced walking with her head held high, even when her legs threatened to buckle. She practiced silence, even when her throat ached to scream. And she practiced courage, not because she believed she could change her fate, but because she refused to give her tormentors the satisfaction of breaking her completely. As the day of her execution approached, Marie began to think less of fear and more of memory. She thought of the palaces that had once sheltered her, the laughter of her children when life had seemed simpler, the whispered confidences shared with close friends. She allowed herself to remember moments of joy, fleeting as they were, and found in them a strength that nothing could erase. Each memory became a talisman, a shield against despair, a reminder that she had lived fully, however tragically. On the final morning, Marie moved with a precision born from acceptance. Every gesture was deliberate, every movement measured. Her hair was arranged simply, her clothes plain, but there was an undeniable grace in her posture, a quiet assertion of self in a world determined to strip it away. The guards saw nothing but a prisoner, The crowd saw a queen. History would remember a woman. As she stepped onto the cart that would take her to the scaffold, she allowed herself one final moment of reflection. She thought of her children and of the life she had known and lost. She imagined a world beyond the revolution, where her children might one day find safety, happiness, and understanding. Her mind lingered on them, holding them close, committing every detail to memory, as if by remembering them she could shield them from fate. When the crowd jeered, she did not flinch. When insults flew, she did not respond. She faced the world as she had faced her trials, with composure, with quiet defiance, with dignity that no executioner could take. Her final moments were not marked by cries or despair, but by an unbroken assertion of identity. A woman, a mother, a queen, in the face of annihilation. And then it ended. Her life, once glittering with luxury and promise, ended beneath the open sky. But the story of her courage, of her human vulnerability, and of the love that had driven her through every unbearable moment would not die. History would remember the complexity of her existence, the depth of her suffering, and the quiet strength with which she faced a world that had turned completely against her.